What if the only evidence that could clear a person simply disappeared at the most crucial moment of their life? What if that disappearance wasn't an accident, but a deadly secret, carefully buried by hands that never wanted to see the truth? Exposed? This is not just another crime story. It is the portrait of a silence that continues to echo years later, like a muffled scream behind bars. A silence that began on the very day a diary, a worn notebook, full of scribbles, dog-eared. Pages and handwritten panes vanished without a trace. On the day of the verdict, the last page was never read. Perhaps because it said too much, perhaps because someone couldn't allow it to reach the right ears. What you are about to discover may surprise you, because this case isn't just about justice. It's about fear, about omission, and about the fragility of a system that can condemn without listening. Have you ever gone through this? Have you ever felt like no one heard you when it mattered most? Then imagine what it's like to have your freedom decided by those who have never seen what was written on your side of the story. The defendant? An ordinary man, neither saint nor monster. One of those whom society doesn't know whether to embrace or eliminate. To some, he was guilty from the first glance. To others, an innocent pushed by desperation. But what could truly reveal who he was right there in the diary, in the words he wrote night after night, as if he already knew he would need to prove what no one would believe. Yet at the decisive moment, those pages turned to dust. Or rather, they were erased from the narrative. And who benefits when part of the story disappears? Criminal psychology shows us that human behavior in moments of crisis can reveal truths that even science cannot predict. The fear of punishment, the hope of being heard, the anguish of knowing that the only chance of defense is about to slip through your fingers. And in this case, the tension was in every detail. The prosecution ignored the diary. The defense hoped to use it as a trump card. And on the day of the trial, it was no longer there. Stay with me until the end, because the more we investigate this disappearance, the more unanswered questions arise. And the deeper we dive into this silence, the louder it screams. It's not just about evidence, it's about the psychological impact of being judged with half of your story ripped away, about the trauma of seeing the truth turn into suspicion, and about the scars that this type of omission leaves, not only on the accused but on everyone who asks themselves, what if it were me? It's not about defending the guilty. It's about understanding what happens when the truth is prevented from speaking. And when silence is forced, what remains is noise, restlessness, doubt. A doubt that gnaws, that consumes, that haunts. Because behind the disappearance of the diary, there's much more than a simple procedural error. There are interests, there are fears, and perhaps there are culprits who were never on the defendant's bench. And when the last word disappears, what remains is the weight of doubt. That kind of doubt that doesn't allow peace, that keeps hammering in the minds of those who followed everything closely, and also of those like you who are hearing this story now and feel that something doesn't fit. Was the truth silenced? Or was it simply not convenient enough to be heard? Every detail we explore here carries a layer of pain, of injustice, of suffocated humanity. And that's why I want to invite you to participate in this conversation. If this topic makes sense to you, if something here touched you or reminded you of a situation that marked you, leave a comment below, even if it's just a single word. Your experience, your opinion, your doubt, all of this matters, because this channel is not just about telling stories, it's about giving voice to what has been silenced. And when you comment, you help that voice echo further. You are part of this. Also, take a moment to like the video, not only because it helps the channel grow, but because it shows the algorithm that this kind of content deserves to reach more people. People who might be living a similar silence, or who have never heard this side of the story. And of course, subscribe to the channel, because if you've made it this far, it's a sign that you value this kind of reflection, of deep looking, of raw truth. Your participation here is what keeps it all going. It was a small town, the kind where everyone knows someone who knows you, where smiles cross paths at bakeries and whispers travel faster than news. It was in this seemingly calm setting that everything happened. A brutal crime, the kind that shatters not only routine, but the sense of security for those who thought certain horrors only happened elsewhere. The victim? Young, beloved, involved in social causes, admired by teachers and neighbors, one of those presences that fill a room without needing to say much. And suddenly she was gone, in such a cruel, silent way that even time seemed to have stopped. The shock was immediate. The town plunged into a dense, suffocating grief, mixed with an almost desperate thirst for justice. A culprit needed to be found, and quickly, because when pain is unbearable, the mind needs answers. And when those answers do not come, the community creates its own truths. That's when his name came up. An acquaintance of the victim, reserved, introspective, with a past that didn't help much in building empathy. The kind of person who at first glance carries a gaze that few take the time to understand, but that many are ready to judge. The newspapers didn't hold back on headlines. Monster among us. Suspect had strange behavior. A simple label was enough for his image to become a mirror of collective fear. Just a few atypical details were enough for him to cease being a person and become a symbol of everything the town didn't want to face, the possibility that evil was closer than it imagined. And the more the uproar grew, the less room there was for nuance, for doubts, for listening. But behind this hastily constructed narrative there were backstories, small pieces that didn't fit, testimonies that were ignored, timelines that didn't match, evidence that disappeared. And of course the diary, that which promised to shed light on what really happened, but which was never read in court. This seemingly simple detail could have rewritten the entire trajectory of pain, judgment, and condemnation. But at that moment, the hidden truth seemed less important than the necessity for immediate punishment. The psychological impact of all this was devastating, not only for the accused, but for the entire town. Families divided opinions, friendships broke, and trust in the justice system was shaken. The transformation of a criminal case into a public spectacle reveals more about the collective mindset than one might think. Because when rage mixes with fear and hope mixes with distrust, decisions are made based on feelings, not on facts. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because behind the face of the accused and the grief of the victim, there exists a web of silent decisions, invisible influences, and choices made behind the scenes that never reached the knowledge of those who most needed to understand what truly happened. He was the kind of person who went unnoticed, not for lack of presence but for an excess of silence. A man with few friends, a restrained demeanor, eyes always cast down. He lived alone, without strong ties in the town, carrying on his face that expression of someone who keeps the world inside and almost never lets it out. For some that was enough. The reserved behavior, the isolation, the past marked by emotional crises, all of this was sufficient for him to stop being just another resident and become the prime suspect. The media found in him the perfect character. It was easy to paint that picture. An enigmatic face, a history of interrupted therapy, behavior deemed strange by those who never tried to understand. He became headline news even before being heard, and the neighborhood, with its half-told stories and impressions forged in the hallway, did the rest. The words unstable, suspect, withdrawn began to appear frequently as if they were synonyms for guilt. The judgment outside the courts had already begun, and the public verdict seemed decided. But what almost no one saw was the other side of this story. The side that talked about accumulative losses throughout life, of a childhood marked by neglect, of a youth in which loneliness became a constant companion. He wrote a lot. He used old notebooks to try to understand himself, to organize his thoughts, to avoid going mad amidst so many contained emotions. It was in the silence of the pages that he screamed. And there, in that diary that vanished, were records that not only told his version, but revealed a trajectory of pain that in any other context would evoke empathy, not distrust. Criminal. Psychology teaches us that the way a person interacts with the world is often a direct reflection of what the world has done to them. And in this case, the psychological profile of the accused showed no signs of violent impulsivity, nor patterns indicating imminent risk. It showed, rather, a man in process, in search of transformation, trying to break with his past, facing emotional crises without support, dealing with the weight of social exclusion every day. But this was not taken into account, because when society decides who must pay, it rarely waits for nuance or context. And this is where we need to pause and reflect. How many times is someone's past used not to understand, but to condemn? How many decisions are made based on assumptions, distorted perceptions, and narratives constructed behind the scenes of reality? There is a profound impact, emotional, psychological, and social, when a person's hidden truth becomes fuel to reinforce prejudices. In this case, the silence of the accused was not coldness, it was trauma. It was the reflection of years of being seen but never understood, because behind the quiet personality and defensive posture, there were attempts to be heard. Attempts that got trapped in the pages of a diary that perhaps was never meant to disappear. The diary appeared almost by chance, during the collection of personal belongings conducted days after the arrest. It was stored among old clothes with a worn cover and pages folded at strategic corners, as if each fold was an attempt to register urgency, to scream without using a voice. It was not an organized document, nor was it crafted to please anyone. It was raw, full of fragments, loose memories, seemingly disconnected notes. But there, amid the written chaos, there was a pattern. There was pain, regret, outrage, and above all, there was an attempt at reconstruction. It was as if he were trying to build his own defense without knowing if he would ever have a chance to use it. The police catalogued the diary, but did not give it much importance. It was merely personal material, according to the report. The prosecution, in turn, dismissed it as irrelevant, claiming that subjective writings do not invalidate concrete evidence. But the defense, when it finally gained access, saw there not only the personal narrative of the accused, but also a sequence of accounts that cast doubt on the timeline, logic, and even the motivations presented by the accusation. They were pieces of an emotional timeline that contradicted the narrative built against him. Among the pages, there was a detailed description of an emotional collapse that the accused supposedly suffered the day before the crime. An intimate account, full of human contradictions, where he spoke about confusing thoughts, a sense of loss of control, and at the same time, a desperate desire to disappear. There were also notes about calls he tried to make, places he had been that did not match what was stated in court, and there were names. Names of people he had supposedly spoken to, exchanged messages with, sought support from. Witnesses who were never called because simply no one knew they existed. Names that could perhaps change everything. The diary was not a confession, but it was also not a direct defense. It was in a limbo, where the truth was not declared, it was felt. It was a kind of emotional mirror that demanded interpretation. And perhaps that's why it was treated with such negligence. Because subjectivity, in this type of trial, is frightening. It demands a type of listening that the system is often unprepared to offer. And it requires a mentality willing to understand what lies behind the obvious, which in practice almost never happens when the accused has already been publicly condemned before even opening their mouth. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the disappearance of this diary on the eve of the verdict raises questions that no one wanted to answer, and each of them leads us to a breaking point between what was seen in court and what remained hidden in the shadows of the truth. Comment. Below, I want to understand what was not said. This helps show that you too are walking this journey. The day of the verdict dawned heavy. It was not just the cloudy weather, it was the atmosphere. Every step inside the courthouse seemed to echo louder. The room was full. Familiar and strange faces mingled in hard, silent stares, as if everyone already knew what was about to happen. But on the defense side, something was off. The key piece was missing. The diary, which had been carefully set aside to be presented that morning, was no longer among the documents. It vanished, without a trace, without explanation, without protocol. The impact was immediate. The defense attorney, visibly shaken, still tried to buy time. He requested a recess, a verification, insisted on searching files, cabinets, even the floor of the courtroom itself. Nothing. It was as if the object had simply evaporated. And it was not just a notebook. It was the only emotional bridge between the accused and his story. It not only cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative, but also humanized a man who had been dehumanized since the beginning of the process. The accused, upon realizing the disappearance, changed. Not in a scandalous way. It was subtle but devastating. His gaze became more fixed, his shoulders more hunched, his expression more tense, as if he understood that something had been ripped from him for the second time. First, his freedom. Now, his voice. Because the diary, although not a technical argument, was the only means by which he could express himself fully. It was there that he had poured out his truths, his fears, his attempt to organize his pain, and now, all of that had been silenced. The prosecution, faced with the absence of the material, maintained its posture, as if that made no difference at all. And perhaps for them it really didn't. The strategy was already in place. The material evidence, though weak, was sustained as sufficient. The narrative constructed around the accused's personality was reinforced with strong words, calculated gestures, and a speech that felt more like a performance. But in the background, there lingered a feeling hard to ignore, the discomfort of a hidden truth that could not be confronted. In that moment, the trial ceased to be merely legal. It became symbolic. The accused was no longer just being held accountable for a crime. He was responding to everything the system does not know how to handle: emotional fragility, subjectivity, human contradiction. And the absence of the diary in that scenario was not just a flaw in the process. It was a symbol of how decisions can be shaped by what is unseen, unread, unallowed to be felt. Because the disappearance of the diary at that specific moment raises questions that go far beyond the prosecution and defense. Questions about control, power, intent, and about the impact of silencing precisely that which could completely transform the course of a verdict. On that morning, when the diary disappeared, a question began circulating in the hallways of the courthouse. First as a whisper, then as an uncomfortable murmur, and soon as a hypothesis impossible to ignore. Who would have an interest in silence? It was no longer just a flaw in the system. It was a selective, precise, almost choreographed disappearance. Someone acted, and those who act like this do not do so by chance. There is always a motive, an intention, a backstage that needs to be protected at all costs. And when the truth threatens to dismantle larger structures, silence becomes a strategy. The prosecution claimed surprise, but some gestures, exchanged glances, small, inexplicable delays during the trial left room for suspicion. After all, the content of the diary weakened the central arguments of the accusation. It suggested a mental state incompatible with premeditated coldness. It pointed out flaws in the presented timeline, and, more than that, it brought names that could open new lines of investigation, lines that the prosecution had never wanted to explore. Would it then be convenient for this material never to surface? But there were also speculations within the defense itself. Someone closer to the accused, a family member who feared the impact of the emotional content of the diary, a counselor who believed those words could be interpreted negatively. It would not be the first time a protective attempt ends up being an act of sabotage. In the eagerness to avoid greater harm, decisions are made without weighing the true impact. It is the kind of choice born from a short-sighted mentality, where controlling the narrative seems more important than the truth itself. And of course, there was a third group, the ones who never appeared in the records, but whose names circulated discreetly behind the scenes. People with direct interests in keeping the focus of the case exactly where it was. Names mentioned in the diary, involved in past disputes with either the victim or the accused, public figures who did not want to be associated with the scandal, people who had much to lose if the official narrative were dismantled. And in such scenarios, the fear of revelation drives decisions that will never be documented, but that leave traces in the forced silences. The most disturbing thing of all is realizing that, in this game of hidden interests, what is at stake is not merely a fair trial. It is the integrity of a process that should represent justice, but that now and then transforms into a battlefield between manipulated versions. From the moment the truth becomes a threat, anything can be sacrificed, including the chance for someone to prove their innocence. Because the fear of the truth almost always hides something greater than the mistake itself. It reveals a structure that preferred silence to exposure, convenience to justice. Imagine being judged for something you cannot clearly explain because the only thing that conveyed your truth was ripped away from you without warning. And now, surrounded by voices that accuse you, all you have is silence. But not that voluntary silence chosen. It's imposed silence, the type that suffocates, that traps you inside, while the world outside decides who you are based on disconnected pieces of your story. Through the lens of criminal psychology, this type of trial is more than unjust. It is emotionally destructive. The human mind needs expression to organize itself. When someone faces trauma and has no space to tell their version, it creates a profound internal impact. In the case of the defendant, the diary was an attempt to order the chaos, a place where he recorded lapses in memory, confused feelings, contradictory desires, and unexplained regrets. When all of this was erased from the equation, he didn't just lose evidence, he lost his very center. It was as if his emotional compass had been ripped away in the middle of the storm. His behavior in court reflected exactly that. It was neither arrogance nor indifference. It was a mixture of fear and disorientation, the gaze that avoids direct contact, the restless hands trying to control something that had already slipped away, the short, heavy breaths typical of someone under constant psychological pressure. And the cruelest part is that this kind of reaction is often interpreted as coldness or guilt, but in reality, it's a reflection of a mind trying not to crumble inside, while the body remains seated before a jury that has already made up its mind. Studies show that when a person is prevented from expressing themselves in a critical moment, the brain enters a state of defense. It's as if there's an invisible fracture between what is felt and what can be said. This generates an internal cycle of impotence, frustration, and self-questioning. Am I behaving the right way? Will I appear guilty if I speak more? Is my silence condemning me even more? It's an emotional labyrinth where every decision weighs heavily, every gesture becomes evidence, every pause becomes judgment. Now I want to dive even deeper into this subject, because the trauma of being silenced in a moment of total vulnerability leaves marks that often time cannot erase. And these marks don't just stay with the accused, they drip down into the entire structure that allowed this to happen. Comment below. It hurts when you're not heard. I want to understand if this part of the story also stirred something in you. The room was silent, but it wasn't an ordinary silence. It was a kind of tension that made even the sound of breathing seem too loud. The jurors were still, as if carrying that verdict was a responsibility that physically weighed on their shoulders. No one looked directly at the defendant. Some kept their eyes fixed on the floor. Others stared at their hands. They seemed present yet distant, like they didn't want to be there in that moment when a man's life would be turned upside down. Or perhaps it had already been turned, and this was simply the final punctuation. The trial had been long. Witnesses contradicted each other, material evidence presented gaps, and the psychological expert's testimony was treated with disdain. The absence of the diary, officially ignored, echoed in the air like a ghost of what could have been said. The defense tried to argue based on emotion, the inconsistency of the facts, the right to doubt, but the prosecution, cold and precise, relied on a sequence of events that seemed well constructed, even if full of holes. And in the end, what was seen was not a quest for truth. It was a battle of narratives. When the jury returned to the room, there was no dramatic announcement. The judge, with a firm voice, asked if they had reached a unanimous decision. One of the jurors nodded. The sheet was passed to the authority. A brief, silent reading. And then, words spoken aloud, laden with a weight that no one in the room could forget. Guilty. The sentence was met with a mixture of reactions. On one side of the room, sighs of relief. On the other, the silence of defeat. And in the center, the defendant, motionless, as if the world around him had disconnected from his reality. He did not cry. He did not protest. He did not look at anyone. But there was something in his eyes that spoke more than any word. The emptiness of someone judged incomplete, of someone who was heard but not listened to. The transformation that followed wasn't just his. The whole room seemed to change color. The feeling was that something had indeed been decided, but not resolved. Because even with the formal end of the process, the feeling that a part of the story had been ignored continued to linger there, like dust in suspension, waiting for someone to finally acknowledge it, because what happened after that verdict reveals much more than the trial itself. It reveals the emotional journey of the people who witnessed everything unfold, but never fully understood what was really condemned there. Time passed, but the case never fully faded away. In old newspaper archives, in legal debate forums, and even in recent podcasts, the trial of that man still appears as a reference, not for being emblematic of justice, but for the noise it left behind. The absence of the diary became a symbol of something that goes beyond the physical object. It became a metaphor for everything that was ignored, discarded, silenced. And the voices that continue to question are not few. They are lawyers who delved into the case after the verdict, forensic psychology experts who analyze the emotional profile of the defendant, and investigative journalists who cannot swallow the official outcome. One of those journalists, in an interview given years later, said something that still resonates. "What bothers me is not the verdict itself. It's the silence surrounding what wasn't said, what wasn't presented in court, that which could have changed the way the jury viewed that man." A retired prosecutor who followed the case from a distance was even more direct. If that diary had been read, the story would have taken a different course. You can't pretend it didn't exist. These fragments of speech recorded in documentaries and reports are not merely memories, they are evidence that doubt never disappeared. In 2019, a group of law students proposed to reconstruct the case as an academic exercise. For months, they gathered documents, snippets of interrogations, and tried to map a parallel timeline based on the notes partially recovered from the diary, which was later located in an internal investigation that was never made public. The result? According to their report, 42% of the content directly contradicted key elements of the accusation. And even if none of this was sufficient to overturn a verdict, it raised a question that no one could ignore any longer. Was the trial conducted with all the pieces of the puzzle on the table? These voices are not trying to rewrite history out of whim. They are trying to expose something much deeper, how decisions shaped by a lack of information can trigger a series of silent injustices. The impact of a process where the hidden truth was not revealed continues to affect not only the life of the convicted, but also the credibility of a system that, little by little, seems to have chosen the comfort of conclusion over the discomfort of doubt. And perhaps it is right at this point that the voices that still question find their strength in the refusal to accept that the pursuit of truth has an expiration date. Because when justice falls silent in the face of doubt, it is those who refused to forget who speak on its behalf. Now imagine with me, what if the diary were found tomorrow? Not a partial copy, not a loose rumor in some forgotten file, but the original. That same notebook, with yellowed pages, shaky handwriting, the words that were never read aloud. Imagine the impact. What would change? Would anyone be willing to reopen the case? Would the sentence withstand the raw light of a new reading, where the defendant would finally have his version heard in full? It's hard to predict the consequences, but it's impossible to ignore what this hypothesis reveals. Because what's at stake is not just an old notebook, but everything it represents. The chance to revisit decisions made in the dark, to confront the certainties built without listening, to break away from the mentality that time erases the uncomfortable questions. The diary in this case is more than an object. It is a symbol of a system that, when choosing silence, not only fails but perpetuates. And if you stop to think, this diary could be anything: a letter that was never sent, a testimony that was not accepted, a forgotten memory that didn't fit into the proceedings. How many truths are buried out there, locked away in emotional drawers, suffocated by fear, guilt, or convenience? How many people were judged without their true intentions behind their gestures, their silences, their lost gazes being heard. This is where the true provocation enters. The problem is not what has already been judged. The problem is what never had the chance to be said. Because true justice cannot afford to dismiss doubt. It needs to confront it, even if that means reopening wounds, admitting failures, or questioning truths that seemed definitive. And perhaps this is the greatest transformation that the reappearance of a simple diary could cause. Not the absolution or condemnation of someone, but the acknowledgement that the truth, the real, the human, the imperfect, need space to exist. Because this reflection doesn't end in the courtroom, nor in the lost pages of a notebook. It begins every time someone decides to listen to what has been ignored for too long. If you've stuck with me until now, it's because something in this content touched you deeply. And that's why it's so valuable to have you around. If this kind of reflection makes sense to you, if this way of storytelling helps you see the world through different eyes, subscribe to the channel. Not just to avoid missing the next videos, but to continue being part of this conversation we've built together so far. And take a moment to leave a comment with the phrase, "I'm with you until the end." That way I know who was truly present in every word, in every pause, in every question mark left hanging in the air. This shows me that I'm not speaking alone, and that this exchange remains alive. And if this video made you think, leave a like. It's just a click, but it helps this content reach more people who also need to hear stories like this. Check out the complete playlist with other stories, but if you want to discover a secret that has never come to light, then watch this other video and stay with me over there. We still have a lot to uncover together.